Welcome to IFA. I fix everything.
Today's project is to replace a rusting brake line and a leaking hose. This is the rear brake line on a 1986 Pontiac Fiero GT. I'm using two flare nut tubing wrenches to remove the line and minimize the collateral damage so the line can be used as a template. I'm using a cotter pin extractor to remove the hose retaining clip. This will allow easier access to the tubing nut. The tubing flare was seized to the nut and twisted the end off the weakened tube. With the clip removed and the line severed, the hose lifted free of the bracket. The brake hose is going to be replaced. It shows evidence of seepage at the fitting, and the rusted fitting would not make a good mate to a new brake line. I'm removing the flare nut from the hose so I can measure the length of the tubing accurately, and to ensure the proper fitting match on the new line. The bench vise makes a great flare nut tubing wrench. The brake line travels across the rear of the engine compartment and connects to the T-block on the passenger side. Prior to removal, I sprayed the nut with penetrating oil. I used a flare nut tubing wrench and a back and forth motion to attempt to break free any corrosion. Soaking the line and seesawing the flare nut was not enough to prevent the tubing from shearing off at the edge of the flare nut. At this point, I decided it's best to replace the entire line instead of repairing the ends. With both flare nuts disconnected, it's time to remove the clamps. There are only two clamps supporting this tube mounted to the rear of the engine bay. Use care while removing the line to maintain its original shape. Now I have the line removed and sitting on the table so you can see the routing of this tube. This end of the line was twisted and distorted while removing the fitting. It needs to be restored to its original shape. I'm using the large, flat, soft rubber jaws of the jaw horse to try to manipulate this tube back to its original condition. I repositioned the line several times and used the jaws to press out any distortions. Now I clamped the line to a table and used a cloth tape measure to measure its length. The line I'm using is a 3/16 72-inch line. I temporarily held the first flare nut in place so I could measure to the first bend. My inexpensive tubing bender does not have a clamping mechanism. I'm improvising a system using a small vise and a squeeze clamp. This will hold the line in place at the marked location and prevent it from rotating. Here I applied a second squeeze clamp to hold the vise to the table, allowing a simpler one-handed operation. Be sure to overbend slightly because tubing has a tendency to spring back. At each stage of the bend, I've clamped the new line to the old line and matched the curvature and direction. This bend is perpendicular to the previous bend, so I clamped the line with the little vise to prevent the line from rotating out of position. If I was going to use this tubing bender in the future, I would likely drill 2 holes in the handle and bolt it to the tabletop. Once again, I clamped both lines to the table and matched the bends and curves. Now I mark the tangent point of the next bend. Having the lines clamped to the table is much easier to configure the bends than having it freehand and trying to support both lines and a marker at the same time. I aligned the marking point with 0 and aligned both gauges on the tubing bender to the 0 point. With the first 4 bends complete, the tubing has now been rotated so the long flat area is resting on the bench. Now I can begin marking the long length of the tubing. In this instance, I'm floating the old tube above the new one so that I can match the angle during the bend. With the tubing still in the vise and the old line hovering above the new one, I'm able to mark the next bend. Because this bend is less than 90 degrees, I'm hovering the old line above the new one and using it as a guide. I've temporarily clamped the 2 lines together to check for alignment. This time I decided I would bend and check the line as I go. Here's a little progress check. I'm approximately 3/4 of the way finished with this complex bend. As the unbent portion of the line gets shorter, the bending process gets easier. I'm no longer clamping the tubing bender to the worktop. My bending is becoming faster and more fluid. Here's a visual progress check. We're nearing the finish line. Pun intended. The line is marked and clamped and ready to bend. I hovered the old tube above the new one and I noticed my mistake. So I rotated the tube 90 degrees in the clamp and visually checked it again. The line was ready, so I swung the handle of the bender 90 degrees and checked the progress against the old tube. To mirror this small bend, I've got the old and new lines clamped together so I can bend as a template. I have just 2 bends left. My last bend aligns with the straightened portion of the old tube. The tube is completely bent and clamped and compared. It's time to reinstall the line. Guide the 2 ends carefully into position to prevent damage. It was much easier to guide the new line into position than to remove the old one. The passenger side was easiest, so I began there. I loosely attached the line to the T-block. I repositioned the driver's side brake cable behind the tubing. Then I connected the line to the new brake hose. I tightened the flare nut with a flare nut tubing wrench and installed the brake hose clip. I secured the brake hose to the tab on the shock absorber. I'm reinstalling the auxiliary cooling tubes. These are only installed on a Fiero GT. And now I'm reinstalling the rear heat shield. The factory brake line had a coil wrap protector. This does not, so I'm installing a piece of split rubber tubing underneath the cushion clamps. The last step is to install the 2 cushion clamps. I turned my attention to the passenger's rear brake hose. I decided on a different method to remove this one. I removed the bracket in one piece with the line and hose. I disconnected the brake line from the T-fitting in the wheel well. Then I clamped the brake line flare nut in the bench vise and loosened the hose while the line remained stationary. This prevented the twisting that had sheared off the other brake line fittings. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please stay tuned for more of the Fiero seized brake caliper videos coming shortly. Remember, subscribers are always welcome.